Right, but his analysis on the Commonwealth fifth Intergenerational Report and the New Look National Party frontbench. I'm joined from Canberra by the national editor of the Australian newspaper, Dennis Shanahan. Dennis, I want to start, if we can, this National Cabinet emergency meeting. It's underway, started about 5:30. You've heard my comments about, I think, the real push has to be on a plan. There is no national plan. It's not publicly available. We seem to be lurching from one crisis to another. We're getting reports coming out that there will be some changes on the card. The Age newspaper is reporting that vaccinations are set to be mandatory for anyone working in aged care. That has not been the case to date. And also that international arrivals in hotel quarantine will be separated from those who are domestically quarantining. So that's Australians moving between the states. Not confirmed, they are reports out, but it seems we might get some tough action, Dennis.
Well, yes, Peter. Look, I think that what we're looking at here are some practical measures on quarantine and vaccination. Let's not forget that a lot of people have been opposed to mandatory vaccinations overall, but also within workers. Some of the unions are not happy about the idea of mandatory vaccinations, and so there are great complexities just in that area of healthcare workers and mandatory vaccinations. I think, though, that while we're still likely to see various things, before the National Cabinet began, we saw the basic problem. We actually, unlike Singapore, have a myriad number of governments with a myriad number of different attitudes towards lockdown and trying to control COVID-19. In New South Wales, we've seen the growth of the coronavirus infections to go beyond New South Wales. And is that in part, as some have suggested, that there should have been a short 3-day lockdown before the cases rose? In South Australia, we actually have a shutout of ACT residents where it hasn't been a community case, and there aren't any cases in South Australia, and yet they're looking at shutting people out and warning of lockdown. Similarly, in Western Australia, only one case, and yet in New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian has ultimately had to go to a really big lockdown. What we are seeing are different attitudes from different state and territory leaders facing different problems, and I don't think there's any way the National Cabinet can come out with some sort of sovereign directive, as you can see out of Singapore, because all the leaders have different agendas. And while you talk about people being sick of the politics, I think that's right, but there are enormous difficulties in the practicalities of exercising that political power. And I think this has been one of the strengths of the National Cabinet. It's also its greatest weakness, and that is that no one can actually tell everyone in that room what to do.
Well, just on that point, I want to go to other things, but of course the Commonwealth's got the whip hand. The lion's share of the funding, the $200 billion, dwarfs anything the states have collectively put on the table, and I think that's where the Commonwealth should turn its mind to bring some order back to this, because it is literally out of control. When you look at what's happening in Singapore, we are damaging our long-term prospects here, Dennis. Let's go to the Intergenerational Report, because that is sobering reading at this time. Pretty bleak picture, decades of deficits, we're told, declining fertility, sluggish growth and productivity, record spending on aged care and health care. We know there's record spending on education. None of that can ever be taken away. It's baked into the budgets, very difficult politically. This should be a wake-up call for reform, but the politics and the 3-year terms, and we saw what happened with the budget back in 2014-15, when you try and wind back some of the largesse, it's very difficult.
Indeed it is. And I think that the key points out of the Intergenerational Report today, well, the key point is this importance of productivity. This has been an issue now for years. The Productivity Commission has been pointing to the need for economic reform. People have said we need to have economic reform. We need to have all sorts of changes to how the economy works and how to boost business. last week, I reported on the fact that the federal cabinet had actually discussed the possibility, just the possibility, of raising the issue of nuclear power before the next election. And that was deemed too hard until there was bipartisan support for the idea of nuclear power in Australia. Nuclear power would be a game changer in productivity and industrial output in Australia. There is no doubt about that. And yet, when Josh Frydenberg talks today about the need for economic reform, he simultaneously makes the point that it's tough and contested. And then Anthony Albanese is making the point that the government's to blame because it's been there for a long time and hasn't done any reforms in the period of the 8 years they've been there. This is true, but let's remember some of the most important reforms introduced by the Hawke and Keating government, great reforms, important reforms that we are still benefiting from, were assisted by the fact that John Howard, as leader of the opposition, said, yes, we'll drop opposition to this, we'll agree to this, we won't block it in the Senate, we will pass it, we'll ensure it gets through. In this period of low productivity, of a COVID impact on our long-term budget, and the budget papers showed this. Yes, don't get carried away with the V-shaped economic return after the pandemic. This is very important. It's very good and the government deserves credit. But what we have seen is that there are going to be decades of debt and deficit that is going to weigh down on the nation. We need perhaps longer terms in Parliament, but we also need a much greater political leadership from all our political leaders, no matter if they are in government, whoever they are, and if they are in opposition, whoever they are.
I do, though, have to quote Margaret Thatcher to say that the Conservatives are not elected to mind the shop either, and they can wait all they like for Labor and the Greens to give them bipartisanship, but they've got to get out there and actually take the fight up and argue with the community about some of these issues, why they are important. I mean, there was no general will for the GST when John Howard took that on. There was certainly no will, let alone a huge opposition for stopping the boats under John Howard and Tony Abbott. Sometimes you have to pick a fight, Dennis Shanahan. Sometimes you actually have to be prepared, Josh Frydenberg, Scott Morrison, to get onto the bloody arena and fight for some of these things. If you sit there waiting for agreement out of the Senate crossbench and the Labor Party, well, good luck. Why are you in politics? It just fires me up that they pass these things over year in, year out because it's all too hard. I want to see them have a fight. I mean, look at this reshuffle from Barnaby Joyce. Good warriors back into Cabinet. Sure, Bridget McKenzie's back there. She's got a ridiculous title of regional this and regional that, sitting in Cabinet with the Health Minister, and she's supposed to do regional health or regional education when there's an Education Minister. Yet they've put resources and water outside the Cabinet. Now, if you look at the bottom line of the budget, the one thing that keeps us out of trouble, it's our export industry. Now, I understand he might have a thing against Keith Pitt and he might have to pay people off. That's fine. But don't punish the portfolios that matter to our economy. It doesn't make sense to me, and I think he deserves a criticism he's copping today.
I couldn't agree more, Peter. I think that particularly on that point of resources, I think that we have resources has kept Australia going during the COVID-19 pandemic. There is no doubt about that. The future is bright as far as the resources industry and exports are concerned. The one benefit of this is that I think Keith Pitt has actually done a very good job as Resources Minister. He's worked closely with the mining industry. We've only just now seen an outbreak of COVID in the mining industry when the COVID pandemic has been going for almost 2 years now. Thousands of workers have kept going and the economy has been kept alive because of that. And I think Keith Pitt was part of that. So while I am disappointed to see Keith Pitt and resources out of Cabinet, I'm actually glad that Keith Pitt has kept hold of resources and water. And as far as this goes, I think that the point you make about the government having to have a fight, one minister said to me, we didn't win under John Howard, because of the GST, nobody liked it. We won because we had a fight about it. And this is the point on nuclear energy. Don't sit back and wait for bipartisan support. It's not going to happen. Take on a fight, take on an issue, and people will follow you for that if you say the nation needs it. Today, we've had an intergenerational report saying that economic reform is absolutely necessary. We have to do it, and the government has to pick a few economic agendas, reform agendas, and say these are worth fighting for, and get out there and do it.
The beauty of nuclear too, and this goes into the comments you've made about the way the Greens have been playing Labor about this offer of an alliance. The beauty about nuclear, if you are on the left, hard left, centre left, and you've been pushing for lower emissions, this exposes you. You know, you've got nowhere to hide if nuclear is the issue that is pushed, because if you truly believe in a decent economy, base load and lowering emissions, the only game in town is nuclear. So I just think it's a fight that the government's got to have, because you don't win a fourth term by just pointing to the other side and saying, vote for us because we're better than them. That's not going to win you a fourth term.
Yeah, indeed. And I think on that point about the Greens offering, you know, some power sharing agreement with Labor, well, Anthony Albanese was too smart to see that. And he just said, no, thank you very much. The problem for Anthony Albanese is that the Greens offer is out there. He is seen as being part of that Labor Greens agenda. And this is where nuclear particularly would split the left, because nuclear is now a climate change issue. It's not an issue just about energy, although it's a huge energy issue. It's about climate change. When Scott Morrison went to the G7 as a guest in Cornwall, and he spoke to all the G7 leaders, all of them were able to talk about lowering emissions because they all use nuclear energy. And some of them are saying, oh, we don't quite use that much nuclear energy, but they buy it from next door. So nuclear is an example of where you could go, taking a really productive element into the climate change issue, as well as parading and fighting for something that is necessary for economic reform.
Well, I hope they've got the TVs turned on in Canberra, Dennis Shanahan, because we've just given them a piece of our collective mind. Thank you for your time.
Lisa didn't have to turn it up.
No, not with us, not with us.